Welcome back to Untold Physio Stories. I'm your host, Dr. E, with Modern Manual Therapy and Edge Mobility System. Make sure to check out our live course calendar at modmt.com/calendar. My co-host and I are going to do another asynchronous episode, so let me know what you think about this one, Sean. At a recent course that I taught live in New Jersey, there was a therapist there who PT was his second career, but he'd been a PT for at least 10 years. He was a former mechanic, and he told me he had a very good understanding of the way the McKenzie Method worked. And he has had chronic low back pain for, I believe, greater than 5 years. And initially, press-ups and extensions made it better, and he hammered those out. And then it returned, and they kind of stopped working after that. Not only was he not really doing them very, very frequently, but he noticed that his flexion was quite a bit worse the more he did extension. The pain didn't really get relieved, and his flexion was way more painful and limited. He has I think a 5-month-old baby. And what he noticed is that when he was taking the baby in and out of the crib, that his flexion would actually get better the more he did it. And then most recently, and any of you parents of younger kids would know that as soon as your kid can learn how to pull to stand, it's time to lower the crib level so that they can't roll out or pull or climb out. So when he lowered the crib, he essentially had to do more flexion in order to put the baby in and out. And he noticed again that his back pain was getting better. So I thought, is this the kind of unicorn that of a Flexion Rapid Responder, or what McKenzie calls an anterior derangement? And I know it's not quite a unicorn, they do exist, but I like to say when I got certified in 2004, McKenzie himself had not seen an anterior derangement, but his staff had, or his faculty had. And I have in the past 3 times. But I wanted to make sure, and this is not something that I normally see, and I didn't also get this on camera, and I really wish I would have. So I started with repeated extension, because more than likely, someone will get better with extension. His flexion was moderately limited, painful, and then his extension was not really that limited. The more extension he did, the further and further back he went, and then when we retested flexion, his flexion was severely limited and painful. We're talking like... and again, he's a very, very tall guy. And rather thin. So when he did repeated flexion, he kept on flexing and flexing and flexing. And also he had extremely flexible hips. So I had to have him actually pulling on his posterior thighs in order to get to end range flexion, because he's one of those people that can bend at a 90-degree angle and his lumbar spine still looks like he hasn't even reversed the lordosis at all yet. He could easily palm the floor after about 5 to 10 reps. Then his extension was slightly blocked, and then the more he extended, he with only 3 to 5 extensions, his lumbar flexion became rapidly blocked again. So this, when you test it back and forth like this, that in the McKenzie method, that would mean that flexion is blocking extension, as opposed to normally, extension is blocking flexion. So that means the more you extend, the worse flexion gets, and the more you flex, the better the pain gets and the better the flexion gets. We repeated this over and over again 2 to 3 times just to make sure I wasn't missing anything, because in the pure McKenzie method, you do it over and over again until you come to what's close to a definitive conclusion. But the crazy thing was he had so much flexion. Again, this is someone who could maybe easily palm the floor, if not elbow the floor. His posterior chain was so flexible, even when he was grabbing his thighs, it was as if someone kind of like bended him and folded him in half. So I think that, in order for him to get to end range lumbar flexion with such flexible hips, he really had to do either seated flexion, almost curling down. I had him kind of put his arms, cross his arms over his chest, curl down his trunk, and then pull on his thighs or pull on a chair to get end range lumbar flexion, or he would need to, and that was the weight bearing version, or just do significant end range overpressure in bilateral knees to chest in supine. Although I think the seated would actually be better because you can kind of control the amount of lumbar lordosis by curling down. So I prescribed doing that. He said he was doing it more regularly, but not quite often enough from a dosage perspective, could be why he wasn't getting lasting improvement. It was, he would sporadically do it throughout the day, plus with his baby. So I said, hey, let's try doing this 10 times an hour. And I've yet to follow up with him, but I do think that was the missing ingredient in that secret sauce, and he was the kind of unicorn that gets better with repeated flexion. I would say repeated flexion with the average person bending forward 2,000 to 3,000 times a day plus sitting, it's unlikely that someone will get rapidly better with flexion. And I'm not talking about like a Peter O'Sullivan kind of fear avoidance. You eventually get someone to flex. I mean, that is more of a chronic pain central sensitization, not quite a rapid responder where you eventually convince someone that flexion is not dangerous for them. That is not like again, it's not a rapid responder. I don't expect them to rapidly improve in range, whereas this patient did. So let me know your thoughts, Sean.
Hey, Erson, Dr. Wells here. It certainly sounds like an interesting case. You don't see too many clients that respond to flexion-based treatments, and I know McKenzie and other literature that has been published that I think, 60 to 80%, I guess, depending on the study, of clients usually respond to that extension-oriented treatment for that sort of posterior derangement. I think it's interesting to hear how, for this particular case, you had to take into consideration how much flexion mobility he had in his hips, because I know some of my clientele that have had lower back pain, a lot of times they also have mobility deficits in the hip. And usually, not always, but that's why they're utilizing their lumbar spine more into flexion with certain movements like bending over into the crib, like you mentioned in your case. Or for like my case, like athletes like bending over to pick up tennis balls or something repetitively, they may not have that hip mobility. And so sometimes they have that repeated flexion moment in the lumbar spine that just sensitizes the tissues over and over again. I have had a couple cases. Obviously, I worked 10 years in Naples, and that clientele tended to be skewed to be a little bit older. And what I noticed is the older clientele that have spinal stenosis, oftentimes during my subjective portion of my exam, they would oftentimes tell me, standing tends to make prolonged standing tends to make it worse. I actually had one guy who'd go to Costco and he would tell me, I'd push the cart, the shopping cart, and it seemed to help my lower back. And obviously that's one of those things to look for as a PT, is a shopping cart sign. That often means that the patient is flexed over onto the cart a bit to sort of open up the posterior canals to give them some symptom relief. And in this particular patient, that stood out to me, and I noticed that his positional preference was into flexion, and I had to do repeated flexion-based movements. Similar to you, I actually took his knees to chest and actually provided overload by pulling on his ankles and feet, almost up over his head, like you mentioned, folding him in half, and doing this repeatedly and kind of holding for end range, 5 to 10 seconds, because obviously for an older adult too, kind of rolling them up kind of compresses the thoracic outlet a bit, and makes it tough to breathe. So, but we would get in there, hold, and release, and he would get significant pain relief, which was good. So we had to obviously work that in somehow into his home program, and we utilized similar techniques as you, which is like flexing over in the chair, or even sitting up, putting his foot up on a chair, like if he was at a store or at a friend's house and he couldn't obviously roll up on his back, he could put his foot up on a bench or a chair and bring that knee into the chest one leg at a time as an alternative sort of relief method. Certainly uncommon to see the anterior derangements. I think it's maybe more common than some of the side gliding sort of responders, but I guess it really depends on their presentation. And overall, it sounds like in your case, if it was something that was more chronic, finding that directional preference is really the big thing. I do see some clients, though, sometimes utilizing flexion-based treatments, and I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts and debates on this too, even though they have a strong preference for extension-oriented treatment, what they have done is seen something on YouTube or gone to a physio who just kind of throws everything at the wall to see what sticks. And they're doing repeated, McKenzie extensions and then turning around and going right on their back and doing like double knees to chest. And I've had to catch a couple of those clients say like, well, why are you doing that? And I said, well, that's kind of what I was told, or that's what I saw on YouTube. And so I had to sometimes deprogram them, especially like to say like, more is not always better, especially if we're trying to desensitize you with flexion by doing repeated extensions. I think it's important, to tell them like, listen, you're getting more symptoms when you are in a flexed position, particularly loaded and flexed, right? Like sitting slumped over at the desk while like working in our trading stocks or whatever you're doing. And I'm like, you can't, if you're doing repeated knee to chest, you're not necessarily loaded, but you are, potentially sensitizing those tissues a little bit more versus going into the repeated extension. Sometimes that cues them into sort of realizing, hey, I am in flexed position a lot. I do need to work into that opposing sort of motion. And that for them, that seems to always give them buy-in. And also they like taking one more thing off their home exercise program list too, right? And I can say, hey, instead of doing those knees to chest, how about you do like a glute bridge or work on like a mini squat, like isometric hold to work on engaging the hips as well as the lower back. Interesting case for sure. I don't see too many of those anterior derangements, and a few that I have, like I mentioned, mostly older adults that have kind of that spinal stenosis sort of symptomology. But anyhow, I think it's really interesting, and I'd love to hear more cases. Be sure to subscribe, like, and if you want to reach out to me, I'm on LinkedIn at Dr. Sean Wells. Hope you guys have a great day.
Hey, Sean, thanks for your feedback. I think you actually brought up a really good point about how some people, either they go on YouTube or even they maybe misunderstand the whole concept of the directional preference, and maybe they'll do flexion, repeated flexion, which helps their extension, or they'll more commonly do some sort of repeated loading and repeated extension, repeated side gliding to the right, but then they feel tight and they feel like they have to go the opposite way. And they end up negating somewhat the actual positive desensitization effects you get from end range loading in a directional preference. They'll side glide to the right, which centralizes their symptoms, but then they feel like they need to even themselves out, whether mentally or physically, or a little bit of both, and they end up side gliding to the left, or they'll do a ton of press ups and then they'll do several knees to chest to even themselves out, or to quote unquote loosen up their back. I would say the other point that is that you brought up is that a lot of people do think they get better with flexion, and I think that some clinicians think that just because someone is an older individual with potentially confirmed stenosis, whether lateral foraminal or central canal, that they are actually, they will always need flexion. But I find that many of these individuals, maybe they're sedentary and they spend, even like non-sedentary individuals, they spend the majority of their day flexing or unloading anyway. So they still do need some form of loading as opposed to unloading or gapping or flexion strategy. So just because someone has confirmed stenosis and maybe they have stiffer hips, I do find that the majority of them still respond to a loading strategy as opposed to unloading or flexion, because they are simply it is more of a novel stimulus. So if you guys like this podcast discussion, make sure to rate Untold Physio Stories 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, you guys have a great day.